Imagine standing at the helm of an unyielding multi-ton steel machine roaring down a track at 60 miles an hour, watching a nightmare unfold directly in your path. Your hands grip the controls, your knuckles turning white as you stomp on the brakes, only to feel the horrifying emptiness of total mechanical failure. Ahead, completely oblivious to the approaching devastation, 5 workers stand on the tracks, their lives ticking down in mere seconds. In this precise moment of absolute panic, you spot a single silver lining, a solitary side track branching off to the right where only 1 worker stands. Your steering mechanism still functions, giving you the immediate power to divert the vehicle, which guarantees saving 5 human lives at the cost of 1. This scenario forces us to look past the immediate panic and focus entirely on the cold, calculable reality of the final outcome. The math of survival demands an answer, pushing us to weigh the value of 5 distinct futures against a single individual. When we strip away the emotional shock, the most logical choice centers on minimizing the total loss of human life. Every human life holds an inherent weight, and when forced into a corner by tragedy, our collective duty must lean toward preserving the greatest amount of life possible. Turning that steering wheel is not an act of malice. Rather, it is a deliberate, rational recalculation designed to mitigate an impending catastrophe. If you choose to do absolutely nothing, allowing the machine to plow straight ahead, 5 families will be shattered by grief instead of just 1. The sheer volume of suffering generated by inaction far outweighs the localized tragedy created by a deliberate, calculated pivot to the right. We naturally seek to optimize the world around us, looking for ways to maximize safety and well-being while reducing aggregate harm. In situations where zero-damage outcomes are mathematically impossible, the path of true responsibility lies in securing the highest net survival rate. This initial dilemma reveals a foundational truth about human decision-making. When crises strike, we instinctively look at the final scoreboard of consequences to determine the best path forward. This fundamental logic mirrors historical moments of extreme crisis, where leaders had to make devastating choices to protect the broader collective. Consider the tragic reality of hijacked flights, where officials faced the agonizing decision to shoot down an aircraft to prevent a much larger disaster. The individuals on those planes were completely innocent, yet the choice to intervene was driven by a stark calculation of total casualties. If allowing a plane to reach a densely populated city means losing thousands of lives, sacrificing hundreds becomes a horrific but necessary mathematically superior option. We honor those who accept or execute these heavy burdens because they prioritize the survival of the many over the few. It is a painful realization that in a flawed world, we cannot always adhere to clean, unyielding rules without causing massive systemic ruin. True moral courage often requires getting our hands dirty by actively choosing the lesser evil to protect the wider population. The ultimate measure of any difficult decision must always rest on the tangible, real-world conditions it leaves behind for the survivors. However, our willingness to calculate lives undergoes a dramatic shift when the mechanics of the scenario require a more direct physical intervention. Imagine standing on a footbridge above that very same runaway machine, watching it hurtle toward those 5 helpless track workers with no side track available. Next to you stands an extraordinarily large individual, whose physical bulk is sufficient to grind the speeding vehicle to a complete halt before impact. If you physically push this bystander over the railing onto the tracks, his death will safely cushion the collision, effectively rescuing the 5 workers. Suddenly, the very same people who eagerly turned the steering wheel in the previous scenario freeze in deep moral hesitation. The math remains identical: 1 life sacrificed to preserve 5, yet the visceral nature of physical force changes how we perceive the action. We must ask ourselves whether this hesitation is a flaw in our reasoning or a legitimate boundaries line. If our primary goal is to maximize the number of living individuals, the physical method of achieving it should technically remain secondary. The reluctance to push a person off a bridge highlights an uncomfortable friction between cold calculation and our deeply ingrained social aversion to direct violence. When you turn a steering wheel, you are redirecting an existing ongoing threat that is already loose within the environment. When you push someone off a bridge, you are actively dragging a completely uninvolved bystander into a deadly situation against their will. Yet from a purely objective standpoint, the worker on the side track did not volunteer to be a sacrifice either. Both individuals were simply going about their day until an external crisis forced a choice that weighed their existence against others. If we allow our emotional discomfort with physical contact to override the survival of 5 people, we are prioritizing our own feelings over actual lives. A truly objective observer must look past the physical unpleasantness of the act and focus on the ultimate net benefit. Saving 5 distinct human beings is a massive victory for human welfare, regardless of the awkward mechanics required to achieve it. To test this boundary further, Imagine modifying the bridge scenario so that you do not have to physically touch the large man at all. Suppose he's standing directly on a mechanical trapdoor that you can open remotely by simply turning a small wheel on the railing. By rotating this wheel, you drop him onto the tracks below, halting the runaway machine and successfully ensuring the safety of the 5 workers. This subtle adjustment removes the visceral element of physical shoving, turning the action back into a clean, detached mechanical choice. Many people find that this modification makes the choice slightly more palatable, revealing how much our judgment relies on mere proximity. If turning a wheel on a bridge feels identical to turning a steering wheel in a cab, the core logic remains steadfast. The primary objective must always be the preservation of the highest possible number of conscious, living human beings within the scenario. We cannot let the mere setup of a choice blind us to the ultimate value of the final consequences. This tension between numbers and actions stretches far beyond mechanical tracks, deeply embedding itself into the high-stakes world of emergency medicine. Imagine working as a lead trauma physician in a chaotic emergency room when 6 heavily injured patients are rushed through the doors simultaneously. 5 of them have sustained moderate injuries, while one single individual is in a state of absolute critical biological collapse. If you dedicate your entire night to saving the single critically injured patient, the other 5 will inevitably perish from lack of care. Conversely, if you allocate your time to stabilizing the 5 moderately injured people, the single critical patient will pass away. In this medical crisis, the choice becomes clear to almost every observer. You treat the 5 and let the one go. The justification relies entirely on maximizing the number of patients who leave the hospital alive at the end of the day. A hospital that prioritizes one life over 5 would be failing its fundamental mission to protect the community. The medical consensus around saving the 5 moderately injured patients proves that we naturally embrace a numbers-driven approach when resources are scarce. In a crisis, a doctor must act as an efficient allocator of survival, ensuring that their energy yields the highest possible return. Spending exhaustive hours on a single uncertain outcome while allowing 5 guaranteed survivals to slip away is an inefficient use of medical skill. The goal of medicine is to minimize total grief and maximize the total pool of health returning to the community. By saving the 5, you ensure that 5 families are spared devastation, preserving a much larger network of human happiness. This clear-cut choice shows that when actions are passive, deciding whom to attend to, we easily align with the greater good. The objective focus on outcomes allows the medical staff to move forward without being paralyzed by the loss of the one. We accept that in conditions of scarcity, the total volume of successful outcomes is the only metric that truly matters. Yet this smooth consensus shatters instantly the moment the medical scenario demands an active, predatory sacrifice to achieve the exact same numbers. Imagine a distinct scenario where you are a transplant surgeon managing 5 patients who are actively dying from organ failure. One desperately needs a heart, another a lung, followed by individuals requiring a kidney, a liver, and a pancreas to survive. With 0 organ donors available on the registry, you face the imminent prospect of watching all 5 patients die over the weekend. Suddenly, a perfectly healthy individual walks into the clinic for a routine annual checkup and decides to take a quick nap. If you were to secretly administer a sedative, harvest their organs, and distribute them, you would save 5 lives at the cost of 1. Despite the mathematical parity with the previous emergency room dilemma, this concept fills society with immediate horror and absolute rejection. We must analyze why an identical equation yields such vastly different reactions across these 2 medical environments. The absolute rejection of harvesting a healthy patient reveals a collective fear of creating a world devoid of basic security. If citizens believed that a routine doctor visit could result in their involuntary sacrifice, the entire medical system would instantly collapse. People would avoid hospitals entirely, leading to a massive spike in preventable deaths and a catastrophic drop in overall public health. Therefore, even from a strict focus on outcomes, sacrificing the innocent patient introduces a massive, systemic negative consequence that outweighs the immediate gain. The long-term damage to societal trust, stability, and institutional integrity creates far more widespread suffering than the loss of the 5 patients. This demonstrates that calculating the greater good requires looking beyond the immediate room and factoring in the broader societal ripples. A choice that seems beneficial in isolation can become disastrous when transformed into a predictable, systemic rule of human conduct. To salvage the numbers in this dilemma, an innovative bystander might suggest a different, highly calculated alternative to minimize total loss. They might suggest waiting until one of the 5 dying patients naturally passes away first, then immediately using their remaining viable organs to save the other 4. This approach successfully navigates the crisis without actively murdering an innocent, healthy outsider who is completely unlinked to the medical situation. It honors the absolute necessity of optimizing outcomes while respecting the practical boundaries required to maintain a functioning, trusting society. By utilizing the organs of the already deceased, you transform a total tragedy into a partial victory for human survival. This shows that human intelligence will always seek creative loops to maximize systemic well-being without triggering destabilizing societal horrors. The goal remains entirely fixed on extracting the highest possible amount of life and utility from a dark situation. These evolving scenarios force us to recognize that human morality fundamentally splits into two major structural pathways of reasoning. The first pathway focuses entirely on the results of our actions, asserting that the rightness of any choice depends on the final state of the world. This approach judges a decision by its utility, looking at the balance of happiness over suffering that remains when the dust settles. If an action results in more living people, less pain, and greater overall stability, it is deemed inherently correct. The second pathway takes an entirely different approach, arguing that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, completely independent of their outcomes. This view establishes absolute, categorical duties that must never be violated, even if violating them would prevent a massive tragedy. Exploring these two frameworks is not a mere academic exercise. It shapes how we draft laws, wage wars, and organize society. The philosophy that judges actions purely by their consequences finds its ultimate expression in the concept of maximizing systemic utility. This framework, famously organized by early thinkers, suggests that humanity is driven by two ultimate forces: the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Therefore, the ultimate goal of morality and governance must be to expand the net footprint of happiness across the entire population. It is often summarized as pursuing the greatest good for the greatest number of people within a given community. When applied properly, this principle eliminates personal bias, requiring decision-makers to view every individual's happiness as completely equal in weight. A king's pleasure does not inherently outweigh a peasant's comfort. Every soul counts as one in the great ledger of public welfare. This democratic approach to value makes it an incredibly powerful tool for social reform and practical public policy. When we adopt this perspective completely, we begin to view governance and legal structures as giant machinery designed to optimize human flourishing. Laws should not be based on ancient, unyielding superstitions, but on measurable tracking of public health, safety, and economic stability. If a law generates more collective peace and prosperity than it does misery, that law is entirely justified. This pragmatic approach allows societies to adapt fluidly to changing times, unburdened by rigid dogmas that no longer serve human needs. It turns moral reasoning into an ongoing, scientific evaluation of actions and their real-world impacts on living communities. The focus remains entirely on the practical horizon, asking how we can systematically elevate the human condition day by day. By evaluating choices through their tangible fruits, we build a reliable framework for navigating the messy realities of human coexistence. However, moving from comfortable classroom hypotheticals to the raw realities of history requires examining actual events where these equations were tested. To fully understand the weight of these principles, we must look at real-life historical cases where survival hung by a thread. One of the most famous legal and moral trials occurred in the 19th century, involving a stranded crew at sea. The case, known legally as the Queen versus Dudley and Stephens, serves as a permanent testing ground for calculations of survival. It strips away the cleanliness of textbook examples and replaces them with the grim, desperate realities of starvation and isolation. Here, the abstract percentages of life and death become concrete choices made by desperate men under extreme ecological pressure. By analyzing this real-world event, we can see exactly how the principles of utility perform when pushed to the absolute edge. The story began with a tragic shipwreck that left 4 crew members stranded in a small lifeboat thousands of miles from land. Among them were the captain, the first mate, a dependable seaman, and a young, inexperienced cabin boy named Richard Parker. They had virtually no provisions, possessing only 2 tins of turnips and no fresh water to sustain them across the open ocean. For days they eked out a miserable existence, rationing their meager food while scanning the empty horizon for a rescue ship. As the days turned into weeks, the absolute physical reality of starvation began to systematically break down their bodies and test their resolve. The cabin boy, who had foolishly drank seawater in his desperation, collapsed into a state of near unconsciousness, his health failing rapidly. The remaining crew members were faced with a horrific, inescapable reality. Without a source of sustenance, all 4 would inevitably die. In this state of ultimate desperation, the captain and first mate began discussing a terrible calculation to ensure someone survived. They noted that the cabin boy was an orphan with no family relying on him, and his failing health meant his death was already imminent. The captain and mate, conversely, had wives and children back home whose livelihoods depended entirely on their return. If the cabin boy was sacrificed, his body could provide the necessary sustenance to keep the remaining three alive until rescue arrived. By choosing to end one fragile life, they could theoretically preserve three lives, which in turn protected multiple dependent families. The math of survival reared its head once more in the quiet, brutal isolation of the open sea. It was a choice between a total loss of four lives or a managed sacrifice resulting in three survivors. After a grueling period of hesitation, the desperate act was carried out, and the remaining crew members survived on the sacrifice for days. Shortly thereafter, a passing vessel finally spotted the lifeboat, rescuing the three emaciated survivors and bringing them back to civilization. Upon their return to England, they did not hide their actions, believing the absolute necessity of survival fully justified the choice. Instead, they were immediately arrested, placed on trial for murder, and subjected to intense public and legal scrutiny. The prosecution argued that taking an innocent life is a permanent violation that can never be excused by circumstance. The defense countered that under the unique laws of extreme necessity, the choice saved the maximum number of lives possible. This real case forces us to decide if the preservation of three lives outweighs the absolute protection of one. Entering a courtroom to judge this historical event requires us to look past our initial revulsion and examine the systemic ledger of well-being. If the crew had chosen to do nothing out of moral purity, all four individuals would have rotted at sea. The total sum of human happiness would have dropped drastically, leaving multiple families abandoned and destitute back on land. By making the grim sacrifice, three human beings return to contribute to their communities and care for their loved ones. The localized horror of the cabin boy's death must be balanced against the expansive avoidance of widespread family ruin. While the act is undeniably deeply unpleasant, the alternative is a mathematically inferior outcome featuring zero survivors and maximized grief. A cold, objective evaluation of the final global state shows that the sacrifice resulted in a higher net survival rate. Ultimately, this historical trial demonstrates that our moral life is an ongoing negotiation between structural rules and actual results. We cannot completely ignore the consequences of our choices without abandoning our responsibility to protect human life. If adherence to a rule results in total catastrophe, that rule ceases to serve the living and becomes an engine of destruction. The true pursuit of alignment requires us to constantly evaluate how our choices impact the actual living fabric of humanity. We must remain deeply committed to building a world that yields the highest total volume of safety, health, and collective flourishing. By keeping our eyes fixed firmly on the tangible outcomes of our actions, we navigate the complex terrain of human existence with a clear, reliable North Star. The intellectual journey through these dilemmas reveals that our minds are constantly seeking an equilibrium between specific moral instincts and overarching principles. When we encounter a fresh scenario, we instinctively apply our existing framework, observe the resulting outcome, and adjust our rules if they lead to systemic absurdity. This constant back-and-forth movement is the very engine of intellectual growth and legal evolution. We cannot rely on unthinking, rigid reflexes when the complexities of human civilization present us with unprecedented crises. Instead, we must treat our moral frameworks as living, evolving structures that must be constantly refined against the harsh edges of reality. The ultimate validation of any belief system lies in its practical capacity to cultivate a sustainable, prosperous, and harmonious world. If a theory cannot successfully guide a captain at sea or a doctor in a clinic, it fails the ultimate test of human utility. Furthermore, exploring these profound concepts carries an inherent structural risk that can fundamentally alter how we view our daily existence. Philosophy operates by taking the most familiar, unquestioned aspects of our lives and systematically rendering them strange and unfamiliar. It does not achieve this by presenting us with completely new data packs, but by provoking a radical shift in our perspective. Once you begin to view your daily choices through the lens of systematic calculation and systemic outcomes, the innocent simplicity of life is permanently lost. You can no longer look at a public policy, a medical budget, or a legal statute without immediately calculating its net impact on human welfare. This shift can be deeply unsettling, stripping away the comfort of easy answers and replacing them with a permanent burden of optimization. It forces you to realize that every societal structure is a choice that actively shapes the collective distribution of happiness and pain. This continuous process of critical examination can temporarily distance an individual from the comfortable conventions of their home society. When you begin to question established traditions based on their actual measurable utility, you may find yourself at odds with those who follow rules blindly. This intellectual distance can make you appear cynical or detached to observers who rely entirely on emotional reflexes to navigate life. Yet this temporary alienation is a necessary prerequisite for true intellectual maturity and effective societal leadership. To build better institutions, we must first step outside the current framework and evaluate it with absolute objectivity. We must be willing to dismantle inefficient, harmful dogmas to pave the way for structures that genuinely maximize human flourishing. The discomfort of philosophy is simply the growing pains of a mind learning to take full responsibility for the world it inhabits. Facing these systemic challenges often tempts the human mind to retreat into the comfortable bunker of absolute moral skepticism. It is incredibly easy to declare that since these dilemmas have persisted for centuries, a single definitive answer must be completely impossible. From this perspective, morality degrades into a mere matter of personal taste or cultural preference, with no objective basis for debate. However, this skepticism is a dangerous form of intellectual surrender that completely abdicates our duty to create a better world. The undeniable reality is that we live out some specific answer to these profound questions every single day through our laws and behaviors. Because our collective choices have real, tangible consequences on human suffering, we cannot afford to simply throw up our hands in defeat. Skepticism may serve as a temporary resting place for a tired mind, but it can never function as a permanent home for a progressive civilization. Therefore, our ongoing objective must be to actively resist this paralysis and remain deeply engaged in the work of systemic optimization. We must approach the massive, messy controversies of our era, from economic distribution to technological ethics, with a firm commitment to maximizing public well-being. Every debate over public health, legal justice, or resource allocation is ultimately a contest between competing visions of human utility. By anchoring our analysis in measurable outcomes and the systemic reduction of harm, we cut through the noise of ideological warfare. We build a shared, rational language that allows diverse communities to cooperate effectively for the greater good of all. The true goal of our intellectual labor is to awaken a restless, unyielding drive to refine our world systematically. In the end, the ultimate measure of our success will be the tangible fabric of a society that produces the highest possible harvest of human happiness.